Francis Weller is a psychotherapist, writer, and soul activist, and the author of this extraordinary book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief. He also co-leads the Cancer Help Program with me, has for the last 4 years, 5 years. So we have the gift of spending time together in these week-long retreats. He does extraordinary grief rituals, both here and elsewhere, and has an organization called Wisdom Bridge that he and his wife Judith, also partner in life and work, do together. And he's brought a depth of understanding of grief to Commonweal and to the many people whose lives he has touched that is really special and especially valuable in this period of time, especially valuable in this period of time. So I won't say more, and I just introduce my friend and colleague and compañero, Francis Weller.
Well, I was thinking, I pity the fool who has to go on after that. And I realized that was me. So, self-compassion, self-compassion. Actually, when I teach weekends on self-compassion, I say this is a weekend in non-self-improvement. So I've already succeeded just by getting up on the stage. And I do want to tell you that I have a cyst on my vocal cords. So every once in a while, I can't speak. There will be a momentary spasm. And since we're all familiar with that kind of experience, we'll just hold it as a moment of silence. Okay? So thank you, Toby. Thank you, Michael, and for inviting me here today. It's been quite a remarkable day, and I get to wrap it up for you. I always thought, well, the last speaker should be a motivational thing, you know, there should be something inspiring, and I'm talking about grief. So, anyway, when we work with people, we say that the deep relationship that we all should carry as maturing and ripening human beings is to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other. And that we are meant to be stretched large by these two powerful processes in our lifetime. And if we shrink our capacity to touch sorrow, truly our ability to say thank you full-heartedly also is diminished. But to pick up one or the other is also not to our benefit. If I only pick up grief, over time I will become bitter. I will become cynical, and I will withdraw from life. If I only pick up gratitude, I begin to live a little bit more on the surface of things and don't develop that deep capacity for compassion for others' suffering. But together, we are meant to become large. Or another way to say it is we're meant to bring these two together into the prayer of life. So I begin with gratitude to my mentors, to my ancestors, to all of you for being here. And just to be able to take this stage at this point in my life is a moment of gratitude. So I will begin with a poem by German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He said, it's possible I am pushing through solid rock in flint-like layers as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, I see no way through and no space. Everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this massive darkness makes me small. You be the master. Make yourself fierce. Break in. Then your great transforming can happen to me, and my great grief cry can happen to you. That's one of the most compassionate grief poems I've uncovered. And it's amazing that Rilke wrote that at the age of 24 or 25 years old. How he had the capacity to understand that at that age, I don't know. But it's a beautiful, beautiful poem. So I do a lot of grief rituals around the country, and I have found myself beginning these rituals by saying how strange it is that we need a workshop on grief. Some of you have traveled 3,000 miles to be here, some from other countries, and it's wonderful. Thank you for being here. But your being here and traveling this far is a symptom of a profound loss at the heart of our culture. We have forgotten how to grieve together. This should be happening in every community across the country, especially now. And the fact that you have to come this far is part of the background sorrow that is there constantly, but we don't even know how to name it. We find it fortunate to have a moment where we're not crying alone. I have patients who come back after a week from seeing me and they say, I spent a lot of time this weekend crying. And I asked them, well, did you happen to share that with anybody? And they say, oh no, I wouldn't want to be a burden. But then I asked them, what would have happened if a friend had called you in pain, saying, I just need someone to hear me? Well, I would have felt honored by that opportunity. But they can't hear the disconnect. Then maybe someone else would also have felt honored to hear your pain. In traditional cultures, in indigenous cultures, there's this idea of what I call the ecology of the sacred. When this ecology is functioning correctly, there is a beautiful call and response between suffering and gift. In other words, my suffering might be an opportunity for you to bring forth your medicine. But in this culture, I'm taught to stay silent with my pain, to almost feel ashamed of it. Or if I do see somebody, I might be in a private practice someplace, one-on-one, which means that we become what I call spiritually unemployed, which is also part of our deep grief. We don't feel needed. So part of what happens in our grief rituals is we begin to really reanimate this call and response between sorrow and gift, between all the parts of the village. It begins to restore it. We come back to what I call the commons of the soul. So I'm just curious, has anybody here ever experienced loss? 2 people? 4? Okay. All right, so a few of you have. The rest of you, pay attention if you want. But my hope tonight in this brief little sharing is that we talk about one core question is how do we become fluent in the rites and customs of sorrow? Because there's an entire dominion within that has its own needs, its own customs, and its own rituals that we have to become familiar with again. We want to begin to know the ground of sorrow. It's interesting that when people experience grief, either in my practice or in the weekends, it's rare that they have simply a grief experience. They have oftentimes a grief terror experience. Far too many of us have had so little holding around our grief that when grief arises, there's a simultaneous feeling of being in free fall. Do you know what I mean by that? We suddenly feel utterly alone in this space around our sorrow. So we don't necessarily just have a simple grief experience. And that's what I want to help people to restore, is simply having sorrow. We all know sorrow. But when it's accompanied by grief panic or grief terror, it's hard to walk into the room freely. So I think Jeannie brought in John O'Donohue earlier today. One of the first things I found that how we come in and approach our sorrow makes all the difference. And there's an idea of John O'Donohue, who's what he calls the reverence of approach. And he said, what we encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree upon the quality of our approach. When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. You could base an entire lifetime on that one idea. What you encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree upon the quality of your approach. When you approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. Can we imagine approaching grief with reverence? Could we imagine approaching our sorrow as if we were walking upon holy ground, which is what Oscar Wilde said, where there is sorrow, there is holy ground. We typically approach our grief with hesitation, with suspicion, with fear, and the hope is to get to the other side of the room as fast as possible without grief even noticing that we've come into the room. So in a sense, as Rilke said, we squander our hours of pain and don't fulfill what grief is asking from us. Grief asks us to engage it, to turn toward it, to work with it. In the old alchemical traditions, they say that what's in the vessel must be kept warm, or it hardens and congeals, and the work is ruined. So how do we offer it warmth? We offer it warmth through our affection, through our interest, through our curiosity, through our time, through our full expression, writing, dancing, singing, clay, whatever it is you do. Every time you do that, you're warming the material. James Hillman said, you get from the fire only what the fire is fed. So if you're trying to keep the material warm, you have to find ways to keep kindling, keep bringing wood, keep bringing things that keeps the material soft and warm. And then the material can move. But once it gets hardened, once it congeals, it's very difficult. Then it settles upon us like sediment. And it becomes the weight that comes in my office all the time, disguised as depression. People say I'm depressed, but really it's oppression. They're feeling the weight of decades, lifetimes, not even their own, but generations and ancestral, all settling upon them now as a great oppressive weight. I'm going to skip that piece. So this idea of the oppression, I think what we came here for the full range of expression, of life. We didn't come here just to get by. We didn't come here to stay small. We came here for a large, exuberant existence. We were meant to live fully embodied lives. Or as Hafiz, the great Sufi poet, said, the small man builds cages for everyone he meets, while the sage, who has to duck his head when the moon is low, keeps throwing keys all day long to the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. We should have a hard time walking out the door. When we gather for the Cancer Help Program, one of the things I say to them is that the cancer, in a sense, has requested, has demanded that you become immense. That you are able to put your arms around despair, hopelessness, terror, anger. That is as alive as anything else. I remember driving home from a men's conference one time with my friend Richard, and he turned towards me, as he often does, and said, so Francis, are you happy? I thought about it for a moment. I said, well, I'm more alive now than ever. I have moments of being happy, and I'm grateful for that. But I also have a lot of times of feeling sad and feeling lonely and feeling anger. And what I want is to be alive, and every one of those emotions has vitality in it. But we have a very strange relationship, even in psychology, between the positive emotions and the negative emotions. Even calling them that is a betrayal of the full range of what we are entitled and asked to embrace. So grief actually becomes a healing opportunity to once again soften the heart and open us back up to the full range of what we are asked to embody. And that's if the conditions necessary are met. So, when cancer or any life-threatening challenge arises, what happens frequently, and I think I've heard others speak to this today, fissures began to form in the foundation of our life, the very carefully constructed life that we put together. And up through the fissures of the foundations come all of the neglected pieces of our life, all the times of self-betrayal, of self-abandonment, of self-neglect, all the untended losses in our lives. I can't tell you the number of people who have said they weren't allowed to go to a grandfather's funeral or a grandmother's funeral, or that when their baby sister died, no one spoke about it. All the untended losses in our lives. So all of these things begin to crack, rise up through the cracks in the foundation, asking to be attended to. The old wounds, the outcast brothers and sisters of our lives. This is good news. Because what soul is asking for is a reclamation of the life that had been abandoned. This is good news. Sitting with cancer patients at the CHP program, I often give them a reference that what they're experiencing is what I call a rough initiation. This is not what you ask for. But like any true initiation that's been guided by villages and by elders and by a sense of the sacred, those three things that happen in initiation are happening to you. There's a severing from the world that you once inhabited. You leave what was. There's a radical change in your sense of identity. And there's a profound realization that you can never return to the life that you had. Now, when that's happening in a contained encounter, which is what initiation is, that is a breakthrough into the widest arc of identity. When it happens after the encounter with a diagnosis, oftentimes it's a shattering into the singularity, the smallest possible feeling of being alone in the world. So to begin to understand that this is actually an initiatory process of breaking you open again, of inviting you into a much larger and more inclusive experience of expression, is quite a profound thing. So we're not meant to go back to the life we once lived after initiation. Or as I said to one person in my practice who was trying to get back to the life he was living before the big heart attack happened, I said, I'm afraid you're going to waste a perfectly good heart attack. You know? These are rare invitations to operating in a different way. Grief, that as I've seen over the many years of working with it, is an amazing solvent. It's able to soften the hardest places in the heart, if we can open to it, if we can make some relationship with it. It gives us a chance to really welcome, again, the places that have been neglected. It is the gateway to compassion for self and others. But what I love about grief the most is that it's a form of protest. Grief is a refusal to live numb and small. The two primary sins of this culture are amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. We forget that we're entangled with each other's lives, with everything that surrounds us, with the green world, with the sky. We forget that we need each other. And the anesthesia, if you look at that word, aesthetics is in there. And as Nina was just saying, this complete silencing of our full expression. James Hillman said that the word aesthetics comes from the Greek aesthesis. And aesthesis is as a moment of being pierced by something so beautiful that it takes your breath away. You're walking around a corner and suddenly you come upon a fox. It takes our breath away. You're having an aesthetic arrest. We have anesthesia. No beauty. No capacity to take in the revelations of the world again. And we have entire industries devoted to anesthetizing us. So part of the recovery of our capacity to feel alive again through grief is to be able to take in beauty and to be alive in this body. I have had the honor and pleasure of teaching at the Minnesota Men's Conference for 3 years. And one of the teachers there was a man named Miguel Rivera from Guatemala. And Miguel is a very lively man, as a drummer, a consummate drummer. And he was sharing a story how he was talking to one of the elders in the village, and he was talking about what's going on in America. And he says, yeah, in the village we sing and we dance for 5 hours and we talk for 10 minutes. You get where I'm going. It seems that in America you talk for 5 hours and maybe you dance for 10 minutes. So that might be the problem. See, it's very hard to move grief through our bodies if our bodies are numb, if our bodies are cold. So part of what we do at our grief rituals is we dance a lot. We sing a lot. We get the drums going. We get the bodies moving. Just had this wonderful image. I got to teach at, you taught at Sophia Center, didn't you, in Oakland? There was a program for many years called the Sophia Center at the Holy Names College in Oakland. And I taught a class there for several years called Reclaiming Our Indigenous Soul. The interesting thing is that most of the time my students were nuns and priests on sabbatical. And I was this, recovering Catholic, and I was finally in charge of the nuns and the priests. So this was my time. And I remember one time drumming, I invited them all to get up and dance. I thought, no one's going to get up and dance. But they all did. They all got up and danced, and they're moving. And it was great, and they're dancing and swaying. And after the drumming was done and we came to a break, this nun in her late 70s, early 80s came up to me and she said, is there any way we could talk sometime today? Or could we talk? I said, sure, maybe I could come down early next week and we could spend some time together. And she said, well, is there any way that could happen today? I said, well, let me make a few phone calls and see if I can change things around. And I could. So we sat down in this tiny little cubby of a room, and she said, when you started drumming, this memory and emotions flooded my body. I went to the convent when I was 15 years old. 2 weeks after arriving at the convent, my father died. The Mother Superior called me into her office and said, your father has died. You can go home if you want to, but if you leave, you cannot come back. And if you stay, you cannot cry. She said, I stayed. And every night I would be gripping the side of my cot, pushing back the tears. But when you started drumming, all of that came rushing back in. What should I do? What should I do? And I said, oh, Agnes, I promise you, in 2 weeks we will do a grief ritual together. But first we have to tell the rest of the students what's going on. And we have to prepare for this together. So the next Monday we got together and I said, oh, in the meantime, tell the other students in your class what you just shared with me. That's too much for a human being to carry alone. So the next Monday we gathered, and my God, the stories that began to pour out of these priests and nuns of truly a lifetime of absorbing thousands and thousands of hours of people's sorrows and having no place to take it. They became the containment field for other people's grief, as well as their own. So we began, I was barely done with the invocation, started the drumming, and Agnes was down there on her belly, sobbing and sobbing and sobbing at the grief shrine. And in this ritual, you can go back and forth to the shrine as often as you want. And so she was like, it was like watching, O'Hare Airport. It's like, she was moving back and forth, and then finally she sat down in a chair, and I called out over the drum stir. I says, Agnes, are you done? She says, no, I just need a break. So finally, the last time she went down to the shrine, she sat there, still as a stone. And after the ritual was over, she shared that, at the final time I went down there, I had this image of a Native American woman holding an infant. I was that infant. She said that was the first time I felt like I belonged on this planet. So it doesn't matter how old we are, right? Like Dean was saying today, that doesn't matter when you start. But to unburden. She was waiting for the signal. She was waiting for the cadence that the psyche is expecting, that there will be others to hold the containment field, so all I have to do is grieve. You get what I'm saying? There's two things required to grieve. There's containment and release. But if we can never utter our sorrows to another human being, I become a permanent containment field for my own sorrow. I can't do both jobs at once, so one of them wins out. And my grief, it's what I call recycling sorrow. Do you notice we're oftentimes chewing the same bone that began decades ago, and we haven't been able to set it down? We're waiting until the signal is given. And when we do offer that, some part of the psyche knows it's time, and the material begins to move. It moves. We're also been waiting to be doing this side by side. We were never meant to process grief alone. One of the worst consequences of individualism in this culture is the idea of privatized pain. Like somehow this is yours. My friend Maladoma Some from Burkina Faso in West Africa said he went home one time after being in America for quite a few years and was sitting down with his elders one time, telling them that, in America they believe that pain is private. He said the elders fell off their chairs. So don't they know that the pain belongs to the village? This is our pain. This isn't yours. This isn't mine. When we go around the first circle, when we gather on Friday night for our weekends, everyone names a thread of grief that's coming in the door with them. And by the time we've gone around the circle, we recognize this is ours. This is the communal cup. Was there anything that was shared that you could not relate to? You might not have had that form of grief. You might not have lost a child. You might not have had cancer. But you could understand the sorrow in that person's body. This is ours. In the San culture, in the Kalahari, they say, when one of us is ill, all of us are ill. But here, you're on your own. Good luck. So part of the thing we have to undo and begin to dismantle is this idea of privatized suffering and also privatized salvation. You're not going to heal alone either. It's part of what I really love about the CHP process. We understand that the context for healing is communal. It is not private. It requires others. As one of my teachers said, it's the solitary journey you cannot do alone. No one can do this for you. No one can stand in your place, but you also cannot do this alone. We require others. We need that support. All right, let's go over the apprenticeship with sorrow. So part of what I've learned in the last 20 years of working specifically with grief is that it's always around us. We have this fantasy that we go through periods of mourning when someone close to us dies, or we lose a home or a divorce. And those are very acute forms of grief. But grief is always around us. When I drive to work in the morning, down the back roads in Sonoma County, every day I have to greet the dead on the side of the road. The possums and the fox and the raccoon and the skunk. And that grieves me. When our hearts begin to open, we take in the sorrows of the world. And that is a requirement for adult men and women. If we don't register those sorrows, who will? It's part of our spiritual obligation to have a heart that's turning outward into the world. But that means the heart can't be numb or hardened by our own refusal to feel our own suffering. So there's grief around us all the time. And part of our ripening as human beings is to know that I have to have the capacity to keep turning toward the sorrows that arrive day by day. So in this apprenticeship, there's a recognition that that grief is not just an emotion, but it's a skill. It's a faculty of being human. And we've received almost zero education on what it means to know how to be with grief and how to hold it and how to be in relationship. So this apprenticeship idea is something that gives me an idea that this is ongoing, that an apprenticeship is a long-term thing, and that every day I'll be given an opportunity to practice. I have an office in Santa Rosa, and periodically, given the weather systems that come through, there are homeless people on my porch, my front deck. And I have to wake them in the morning and to let them know that it's time to get up. And we exchange a few words. They thank me. But that also is part of the tear in my heart. They're not separate from me. Therefore, by the grace of God, that would be me. Huh? So this idea of the apprenticeship has about 5 or 6 different things. The first one is to come into right relationship with sorrow. We tend to have a polarized relationship with grief. We either are pushing it away or we're drowning in it. But neither one of those is effective. Neither one of those helps to move grief along. So the very first thing we need to learn is, how do you come into right relationship with it? How can you begin to imagine it as a companion walking by your side, coming near, almost developing an intimacy with grief? The second thing we are asked to do is to develop a practice of some sort. And I don't care what it is, whether it's writing or painting or dancing or knitting. It doesn't matter. A practice provides ballast. Because there will be some storms that come along that are much more intense than others. And when the intense weather systems come through, we need to know that there's something holding us at ground. I like the image of the hold fast. And the hold fast is that if you go out to the ocean, you'll see the kelp beds. You know, when the big storms come through, most of them make it. It's because of the hold fast. A hold fast is that chemical bond between the base of the plant bulb and the stone itself. So a practice is a form of holdfast. It gives us a way to really anchor ourselves when things become intense. The third part of this apprenticeship is about learning to stay in the adult when grief is present. And I often say we could spend a weekend on this one idea. And what I mean by this again is that frequently when grief shows up, and I can see this in many faces in my practice, but also a lot of times in the weekends, when the grief arises, suddenly the 55, 65, 45-year-old face disappears, and there's a face of a 5-year-old taking over. Suddenly, we are possessed by this child who has absolutely no capacity to process what is rising in their body. And they go into that terror and that panic. So teaching people how to migrate grief from the child into the adult is a crucial part of the apprenticeship. Moving it from who was holding it for you into someone who can actually begin to work with it and tend it. Does that make sense what I'm saying? This is a very crucial part. And again, because so few of us had communities that were there to help us hold our grief when we experience it, particularly in childhood, there's this feeling of our grief not having a bottom. So when we get near it, there's this feeling of it's bottomless. And people will often say in my practice, you know, you're asking me to go in that room. And if I go in there, I'm not coming back. I'll get lost in there. And I say, well, if you don't go in there, you're not coming back. So much of our vitality. There's a wonderful line of William Blake's who says, we must go to heaven for form, and then we must go to hell for energy, and then marry the two. It's brilliant. Blake in the 1800s knew that much of our vitality is shunted into what now Jung calls the shadow. We lose touch with that vital energy. And there's so much vitality in grief. Grief is not a deadening. And you know it when grief is around you. It is wild. It is feral. You can't control what's happening to your body, to your emotions. Grief refuses to be domesticated. The fourth part of the apprenticeship is silence and solitude. So I speak a lot, almost endlessly, about the need for community around grief work. But I also know that the majority of our time with our grief will be alone. And so we also must cultivate a deep and abiding connection to silence and solitude. Silence is a kind of hospitality. It is an invitation for deep listening, for those voices that have been silenced or pushed to the far margins of our life are finally being listened to in that silence. And solitude is an offer of sanctuary. It's a difficult one because frequently we are fearful of what arises in that silence and in that solitude. I remember one woman I was working with who was dealing with a very painful divorce. She said, I hated going home at night because the house would be cold, it would be dark, and I would feel so utterly alone at that moment. I said, well, could we imagine this as the most holy hour of your day? When you walk in the door, you're invited to meet the most vulnerable part of your life. The sister of yours who feels so alone in the world. Could you imagine walking in the door and greeting her and making her a cup of tea? Could you imagine welcoming her with a warm cup of soup? Could you imagine letting her know that the fire will be lit shortly, that she won't be alone? And then this line of Rilke's came into my mind where he once said, I am too alone in the world, but not alone enough to make every minute holy. Isn't that gorgeous? What he does in that one little move, I am too alone in the world. That's the loneliness that we're so familiar with. I am too alone in the world. But then he makes this move, but not alone enough to make every minute holy. And when he does that, he's turned it from isolation into the sanctuary of solitude, a place for the soul to show up and express itself fully. And the last part of this apprenticeship is self-compassion. My losses matter. I remember the first time that revelation came into my body and the tears fell down my cheeks after decades of holding it tight. It wasn't until the third grief ritual that I shed my first tear. I knew I needed to go because I knew I had a lot of sorrow packed in there. I mean, I was a well-packed white man. I was going to get by, and no one was going to see what I was carrying. But the third time I went, and I thought the same thing was going to happen again, no tears. And someone came close to me that I knew and trusted and put his hand on my shoulder. And that was it. I was on my knees for hours. And that was like a baptism. The waters down my cheek were like washing away. They were just so powerfully healing. And the beautiful thing they've now found in scientific research is that grief tears are the only tears that take toxins out of the body. Did you know that? Grief tears remove not oxytocin, no, what's the stress hormone? Cortisol. It takes cortisol and all the other stress hormones out of our body. And we talk about it as a good cleansing cry, don't we? Well, that's quite true. That's quite true. So this idea of self-compassion, we're brutally hard on ourselves. People even arrive blaming themselves for getting cancer. People come to my practice, they want to change. There's this immediate urgency to change. And as I listen to them talk about why they want to change, underneath it is all this self-hatred. And this absolute belief that unless I get my stuff together, I won't be allowed in the circle. And it's all this unrefined material of me that keeps me out of the circle, right? So psyche, soul, will not tolerate that as a premise for your work. So we begin with self-compassion, teaching self-compassion, learning how to begin to turn toward the suffering of our lives with kindness and mercy, tenderness. So what do we need to honor our grief? We need community. Grief has never been private. In our long story as a species, grief has always been communal. It has always been expressed in the arms of the village, not in our isolation. Okay. Last thoughts, then we'll do questions. We need a ritual ground. I like what I'm hearing about what happens up in your area. There's a lot of emphasis on ritual. Ritual is the oldest art form we know of as a species. We were probably doing ritual before we even spoke. It is a language older than words, and it speaks to the most archaic layers of psyche. So when we go into ritual space, we're inviting the oldest knowing of us to come forward. And to be able to move into that space collectively is quite powerful. I have to tell this story. It's about trauma and healing. I was in the village in Africa, and there was a young woman there, 17, 18 years old, very vivacious young woman, and she had this large burn scar across her face. And I asked my friend Maladoma, what happened to her, just out of curiosity. She said, it was terrible. One day, her mother threw boiling water on her in a fit of rage. I said, well, what happened? Well, the whole village got around this young girl and said, this had nothing to do with you. You are beautiful. You are ours. You are loved. You are cherished. You are good. And in that moment, I understood that her wound remained superficial. It did not pierce and become a lifelong definition of worthlessness. When trauma, when pain is inflicted and it's uncontained, it mutates into trauma. But contained pain, like that young girl had, is not simply, but it becomes something tolerable and workable as sorrow, as grief. It was sad that that happened, but she could process feelings of sorrow, particularly with the arms of community around her. You get what I'm saying? Too many of our times of encounter like that are left with all our own experience and nothing to reflect back something different. So we begin to create our own fictions about it. And as Jung would say, it's impossible to not live with the story. The question is it a healing fiction? Or is it a debilitating fiction? Most of us live with debilitating fictions until we're freed. So final thought, when we do the Cancer Help Program, I give them a list of 10 practices that I think help to optimize the healing response of psyche and body to their cancer. And we talk about self-compassion and creativity and imagination and beauty, ritual. And the last one I offer to them is service. That at some point in their life, around their healing process, they will be asked to give away what they learned in their encounter with cancer. Their healing process, in that sense, was not meant for them alone. Ultimately, it's meant as a giveaway. See, the apprenticeship in the old language of becoming a carpenter or a farrier or a stonemason, you would go through the long process of apprenticeship to become a master. In soul language, you go through the long apprenticeship with sorrow to become an elder. And the elders are the ones who walk the street, who have been able to metabolize their grief into medicine. And they've taken their place out there and are throwing it like seed. Okay. This is a poem called Cold Solace by Annabelle Kaufman. When my mother died, one of her honey cakes remained in the freezer. I couldn't bear to see it vanish, so it waited, pardoned, in its ice cave behind the metal trays for 2 more years. On my 41st birthday, I chipped it out, a rectangular resurrection, hefted the dead weight in my palm. Before it thawed, I sawed with serrated knife the thinnest of slices, Jewish Eucharist. The amber squares with their translucent panes of walnuts tasted even toasted, of freezer, of frost, a raisin delicacy delivered up from a deli in the underworld. I yearned to recall life, not death, the still body in her pink nightgown on the bed, how I lay in the shallow cradle of the scattered sheets after they took it away, inhaling her scent one last time. I close my eyes, savor a wafer of sacred cake on my tongue, and try to taste my mother, to discern the message she baked in these loaves when she was too ill to eat them. I love you. It will end. Leave something of sweetness and substance in the mouth of the world. Thank you. Five minutes. We have a whole 5 minutes for questions, thoughts, feelings.
Hi.
Hello.
So I'm starting to work towards building community where I work. So I'm having a trauma healing day this Sunday, and one of the groups, it's a women's empowerment group, and I'm trying to make it so that people, like a safe space. I'm working with a therapist, and I'm just getting my hands on anything I can in how to lead a group, but not lead it, but in a way that's not hierarchical. But anyways, that's a whole nother thing. You've mentioned like grieving together as a community, and I was wondering like where would be a good, like if you have any tips on how to invite a group to grieve or to be a container and share and rotate, like being a container and then releasing, you know?
Good, excellent. I think if you're going to be in that chair the first time, it's good to have some shared agreements. One of the biggest ones is that grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a presence awaiting witnessing. And so we're going to witness one another. We're not going to give advice. We're not going to fix this. We're not going to say, you should. Or why don't you? Or when this happened to me, I did this. Let's just make a space for it. You might want, and then practice what I call revelatory speech, which is if something gets shared in the circle that touches you, don't comment on somebody else's experience, but share what's moving in you. So we practice revelation. We agree to be confidential. What happens in here stays in here. Okay? We practice deep listening. And we practice a certain resonance of space between sharings. And you can begin by bringing in simple rituals. I offer a couple of rituals in the back of the book. That's a plug. But just in case. We do a stone ritual, which is very simple, but people stand in the middle of the circle with a bowl of water. You speak your grief out loud, put your stone in this bowl of water. You begin to see that I'm not alone with my sorrow, which is one of the most important things for us to begin to sense, particularly now. We can feel utterly overwhelmed by the condition of the world, and we can feel so alone with it. So to begin to build little circles of welcome is really necessary right now. So thank you for doing that. Yeah. Wait, one more.
Three things, actually. What an incredible, extraordinary day. One, there's a conference, a cancer conference in Florida, the beginning of March, that is like being in community. It's the most heart-based conference I've ever been to, and community is critical. It's called the Annie Appleseed Conference. I'm actually going to speak there if anybody has any questions. One of the things I learned when you talk about the child and letting the child shows up in extraordinary grief.
Yes.
One of the things how many decades did it take to learn it, was that the child was the vulnerable one. And when I go through that kind of grief, I bring my adult in and hug that child and hug the teenager.
Yeah.
And it allowed me to process.
Yeah.
And the last thing was I went to do, because we're in a cancer group here, I went to do plant medicine in Peru in February, and you get extraordinarily nauseous, and I couldn't release the nausea. When I started the deep grief crying, the nausea went away. And it was the closest connection to, oh my God, my emotions are so strongly contributing to my illness, because the nausea left. And I just wanted to share that to underline how incredibly important everything you've just said is.
Thank you. I would just say that one of Jung's ideas that you cannot heal what you cannot separate from. So that's an old alchemical idea. So when that child part comes up, like you were just saying quite well, and you're so entangled with that child part, but until you get some separation, until you're able to turn toward that part of you with compassion, with big heart, big arms, that part will continue to have, in a sense, the default mode of response to it. Okay? So practice separation. All right. Thank you very much.